Well, I think the one thing that I've always said was the biggest barrier to anything going on in the South was not racism, not classism, not misogyny, not anything like that. The biggest barrier to things going on in the South is provinciality. And the problem with liberalism in the South is that it passes for radicalism. If people are working on reproductive rights or racial discrimination or rights for LGBTQ people, it's seen as a radical act, an act of transgression or an act of resistance. To a degree, it is because it is a conservative state. But the fact of the matter is that these politics are very mainstream across not only the United States but also all of the West. It's not really, from a larger geographical perspective, it's not really that radical. And I feel like that when people from the South who are doing this type of liberal work go to outside the South, they're sort of met with a great deal of sympathy and like, man, you're doing God's work by doing that kind of work in the South, so on and so forth. And it's not really taken seriously. It's more like, well, you're doing the same thing. You're kind of cute. It's cute. Like this kind of work is cute that you're doing it in the South. And it's not really taken seriously. When we do stuff in the South, nobody comes. Nobody attends our events, our speeches, anything like that. But when we go outside the South, we get fairly large crowds, 30 to 50 people. And we never get the narrative that, oh, you're doing God's work in the South. We get the narrative that, oh, this is really innovative stuff. And it's really hard to get traction in the South. We don't get media attention. And people just really don't know what we're doing, or don't, if they do know what we're doing, they don't really understand it. I think people in the South think we're kind of cute. And when we go outside the South, we're taken seriously. And when we're in the South, we're kind of not taken seriously. Like, if you're not doing liberal reform stuff, it's not really a serious work in the South. The fact of the matter is that the liberal reform work sort of nibbles at the corners, because that's what liberal reform does. It nibbles at the corners. That's what it's supposed to do. If we want real transformation in the South, we have to have a real radical politics that starts with an economic analysis of what is going on in the South. And the big thing that's going on in the South is that we don't own the wealth. And I think part of the reason why this doesn't get traction is because both Democrat and conservative politicians are on board with our economic model, which is natural resource extraction and cheap labor, which is why you don't see Democrats lining up to support union drives in different places, and why you see Republicans actively working against it, because they know where their money comes from. Their money comes from the auto manufacturers. Their money comes from the timber companies. And to really get at a radical politic, those institutions and those people are the ones who control the state of things in Alabama. And while ending discrimination is important, LGBTQ rights is important, what is more important is owning the wealth. Because if you own the wealth, people can't take your rights away, right? Like, there's non-discrimination ordinances that are passed in cities for LGBTQ people. You can't discriminate in housing, you can't discriminate in jobs, so on and so forth. Well, you know how you cannot be discriminated against in housing? Own the housing, own the businesses, that sort of stuff. So we need a shift away from liberalism in the South, a big shift away from liberalism in the South. At least some people to shift away from liberalism in the South, and especially in Alabama, and start paying attention to the sort of foundational aspects of Southern society that are often taken for granted, and that have been this way for generations and generations and generations, back past the end of slavery, past the Civil War, to the very beginnings of when the South was colonized by Europeans. So we need this radical politics, and we need to recognize that it is important to raise money if you have liberal organizations from outside the South and get support outside the South. I get that. But we also need to recognize that a lot of those institutions and people that are donating money are donating it out of sympathy and because they think it's kind of cute that people are doing this type of work instead of a real belief in a strategy to transform the South. And we do have a strategy to transform the South, and we are implementing it. It's difficult, but it is working. So pay attention to what we're doing and study. I mean, I hate to say this, but our institutions of higher education are not doing a good enough job of training the leaders of the future to have the analysis that they need to be able to really understand what's happening. You know, there is training in critical race theory, there is training in feminist theory, and people sort of get to that point, but it's still just a version of liberalism. There's not the radical training like I got at Berkeley, which made us look at the very foundations of state, capital, and society and why these things work the way that they do. I think it's going to be increasingly important as climate change ramps up, as we have more wars, to start looking at the foundations of American and Alabama society and start thinking about if these things actually work. And we need to look at other places that are similar to Alabama, not look at New York City, not look at San Francisco, but look at places like Mexico, who has a similar economy to Alabama, and see what the type of stuff that they're doing to help their people survive and thrive in a changing world. So anyway, yeah, we need to look at what other people are doing across the globe and try to implement some of those types of projects here, which is what we've been doing for the past 5 years with the Educational and Economic Resource Organizing Network, which is now 6 or 7 organizations across the South trying to build basically a new society. But getting the attention on it and getting the resources to be able to do it is a constant struggle because people just don't pay attention and don't think it's important because they're wrapped up in what is essentially a mainstream liberal approach to politics, which nibbles at the corners. That's what liberal reform does. It nibbles at the corners. We need radical change, and we need to focus on the type of work that we've been doing for years to achieve that radical change. So we'll talk to y'all next time. Peace, y'all. Ren. Ren. Come on.